my friends.
Okay. Everybody knows Tejas Kapadia?
Yeah.
An attorney who supports us, and we love to support him. He's a great guy and a great attorney, which is more important. So he goes over, yeah. Patty says yes. So he goes over the contract line by line, and I'll tell you, I learn something every time. So if anybody doesn't have one, let me know.
Well, thank you for coming out today, and we're gonna go through this thing. A little quick background on me. I've been an attorney about, 20 years now. So it's been fun, it's been exciting. More than a decade of it, if not more, has been dedicated to real estate practice. So I'm pretty familiar with this contract. What I normally do is go paragraph by paragraph in order. I'm gonna switch that up a little bit today. Because I think by the end of it, most people are, you want to bang your head against the table. So I want to hit your key points first, and then we're going to go back and hit all the rest. Right. So the key point that I want to start with is weirdly not the first page. It's the second to last page. It's paragraph 42. Now, if you look at paragraph 42, it says addenda on it. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So when you're dealing with property, when you're dealing with these contracts, no two properties are the same, right? They're like people, they're snowflakes. Everybody is different. So what you need to do is tailor your contract to an extent. And that's what paragraph 42 permits you to do. These addenda correlate to an actual written document that you have, and you attach that document to this contract if that condition applies. So if you look at 42, right, let's say the buyer needs to sell something before they buy something. That's the very first box. Buyer's property sale contingency. So if that's a situation, you check mark this box, find that document, fill it out, then everybody signs a contract and that addenda that you filled out. And that addenda becomes part of the contract. Make sense?
Mhm.
So, and you have all these different, conditions there. Private well testing, 3 or more units, new construction, et cetera, et cetera. So you find what condition applies to your particular property, check mark it, attach it, everyone signs it. Now, some things don't fit in a box then, right? Kind of like people again. So that's where you have paragraph 43. If you flip over, paragraph 43 is a bunch of blank space. This is actually a tremendously useful provision, and it's very, very important for attorneys. This is kind of like, let's say they're waiving inspection. Let's say they're waiving appraisal. You throw that in here. So when I'm doing attorney review, I've talked to the clients, of course, before I start review. Most of them have no idea what's in the contract. Most of them have no idea what they've actually agreed to. Right? So me talking to them is not exactly an informative moment in my life. It's more like I'm giving them information about how the whole process works. So for me to understand this particular contour, I'm looking at it over here. The ones that I'm particularly interested in are inspections, waiver of appraisal. Because there's a lot of language that I put into a writer to flesh both of them out. All right. So if you say waive appraisal, what does that really mean, by the way?
Saying to be appraisal. You don't have the power to waive an appraisal. But you can have the power to waive the appraisal results.
Correct, but even more than that, because there's actually 2 contingencies that come into play. There's your mortgage contingency, there's your appraisal contingency. So what you're really saying is that insofar as a mortgage is concerned, I, buyer, will make up the difference if there's a shortfall or restructure my loan. I'm not just waiving an under appraisal contingency. Do you see what I mean? They're actually 2 distinct things. I know what you mean, which is really, if it under appraises for mortgage purposes, you're gonna up your down payment. But that's what I flesh out in attorney review. And when I see that over here, that's my trigger point for me to do that kind of documentation in the writer. Same thing for inspections. I waive everything but major structural, mechanical, environmental, or safety. I put that into the writer. Right, these are core terms, and I don't want to rock the boat when I'm sending out buyer's writer. And if I'm seller, I don't want to lose out on something that was a core component of the understanding. So when you have those kind of weird, quirky things that don't fit in paragraph 42, you put them in paragraph 43. If there's a question mark on how to phrase it, maybe you're not certain, what to write, work with an attorney who will pick up your call. I will. And I will walk you through basic language you can put in there, right? You're not an attorney, and I don't want you to become one. There's way too many in this state. But I also don't want you to put in something that leaves you kind of on a limb. You see what I mean? So I want you to have the basic material in there, and then I'll flesh it out. All make sense? So those are your two probably most important paragraphs for tailoring the contract. The rest of it is how do you fill it out? So going back to the first page, which says page of 1 of 14, this is where they both sign. This is just a notice to the buyer and seller, right? But this should be filled out and signed. When you get to the meat of the agreement, so to speak, sorry, I love using that expression. I'm a vegetarian, so it's the only time I can say the word meat and it has any value for me. So if you look at the first part, you have the table of contents and you have paragraph 1 where it says buyer. Now this is self-explanatory. You put in the buyers. Who do you put in as buyer? Maybe it's not as self-explanatory as I'm making it up to seem. Let's say you have one buyer applying for the loan and one not applying for the loan. They just want to be on the deed. You put both names down. This is not related to who applies for the loan. Whoever is going to take ownership, they go over here. Does that make sense? Right. If you put in their current address, that's great. Frankly, it's okay if you don't. But if you have it, put it in. Paragraph 2, seller. Who's the seller? Mainly, it's the people on the deed right now. All right. So the bigger problem I'm seeing nowadays is what if the person has passed away? Then what do you put there? Then it's the estate of the person who's on the deed. So if John Doe was on the deed and then he passed away, now the seller is the estate of John Doe. If you want to be completely accurate, you'll find out who the executor is, and you'll say, you know, Jane Doe, comma, executrix, comma, for the estate of John Doe. Does that make sense? Rare that comes up. I mean, knock on wood, which you did with a lot of people pass away. But if you're dealing with the state, if you want to be completely right, the executor, executrix, for the estate of whoever died. Right, as you go further down, the property address, that's a property being sold. So that's where you list out that property. And now you get to paragraph 2. And this is really a breakdown of the purchase price, your deposit, and the mortgage. And this gets a little repetitive in other parts of the contract, but this is fairly important. So the very first line, purchase price, put down what you're selling it for. If you're giving a concession, do not factor in the you put down the gross amount. So if I'm selling a property for 300, giving a $10,000 concession, I'm not putting 290 here. I'm putting 300. Right. Underneath that, the initial deposit. Most people leave that blank nowadays. In the old days, you had 2 deposits. One when you signed and another due 10 days later. Most of the time, we kind of ignore the initial deposit and we only focus on the one that's due 10 days. So you can leave that at 0. The additional deposit is a 10-day deposit. The rule of thumb is 10%. 10% of your purchase price should equate to the additional deposit, but that's a rule of thumb. What I really significant comparison to the value of the property. So let's say you're selling on a $1 million property, right? 10% of that is 100,000, but somebody puts 50,000. Are you really going to walk away from 50,000? You know what I mean? It's significant enough. So keep that in mind. The idea of the deposit is that it establishes the buyer you're working with is genuine. It's not to keep the money, right? You'll get the money when you sell the property, but it's really to make sure this is a genuine buyer. If you have a doubt of the liquidity, that's why you have proof of funds. The additional deposit won't give you much insight into that, right? A lot of the sellers that I work with, they don't understand what the purpose of that deposit is. So they get very hung up on that value. But if you can talk to them and explain the purpose without crossing that line to giving legal advice, you know, try your luck. If not, punt it, send it to the attorney saying, you know, like maybe you should talk to the lawyer as to why this value is there as opposed to another value. Make sense?
For example, in this section that you said initial deposit,
That should
it
be
could
0.
be 0.
Yeah.
So what is better? Let's say to put like, instead of putting 2020, better to put 40 as the.
Yeah,
additional
so the whole
deposit.
40 would go on the additional deposit line,
Yeah.
and the initial deposit would be at 0.
So it looks better. It's better to
It
do
looks
this.
better. It's cleaner. and it's more accurate as to how the transaction will work. Any question?
How about the buyer? They're buying it in an LLC.
Mhm.
They're listing an LLC.
Correct, then the company is the buyer. You do not need to put down any of the members, none of the principals, it's just straight up the company. Now, the mortgage, that's the amount they're applying a loan for. Little thing about the mortgage, whatever you put there, treat it like a cap. They can apply up to that value. They can always apply for less than that value. You see what I mean? So if I throw down, I don't know, 800,000 in my example, for the amount of the mortgage, and then the client, the buyer's like, I want to only apply for 750, and I'll give more of a down payment at time of closing, that's fine. Don't need an addendum unless the lender requires it. But you can't go up to 850. Do you see what I mean? It's a cap. Right? Underneath that, the balance of the purchase price. That is the amount they bring to closing with their closing costs. So you just do the math. You subtract out the additional deposit, subtract out the mortgage. That's the balance of the or balance of the purchase. Make sense so far? Am I boring you yet? Give it time. I'll get you there. By the way, pizza's here, so if you all wanna slowly siphon back and forth. Yeah,
Quietly, not slowly, quietly.
quietly. Paragraph 3, the deposit, and that's what I mean about the redundancies in the contract. So letter A doesn't really apply unless you put it by at the initial deposit. But this is the amount that would have been provided when they initially signed the contract. Like I said, most people try to avoid that nowadays. To give you background as to why, what happened with that initial deposit is most of the time you didn't have a lawyer by that. That would go into the trust account of the brokerage house. And there's some process to pull it out of a trust account of a brokerage house. So you might end up with delays at closing trying to get that money out because people forget about it. Because it's normally a very nominal sum. It'd be like 1,000 or 5,000. So everyone forgets about it. Then you get to closing and you need that money and it actually cause delays to get that out. So that's why it's better just put it at 0, less liability for the brokerage house, less liability for you, cleaner transaction for everyone else. See what I mean?
How many of you are guilty of that? Getting to close and going, where's the $1,000? And they're like, and you're like, oh my God. And you had to run up to corporate headquarters. Oh, it was a mess. It was a
It was
mess.
bad.
Yeah.
So now you get to letter B. All right, and this is the additional deposit. This is the one that you saw on the first page, the 10% as your rule of thumb. Don't leave blanks in the contract. Now, if you leave a blank, there is a default time period next to it, and the default for the deposit is 10 days by contract. But don't leave it blank because people like to argue, especially in the current market. So if you leave it blank, some other attorney will be like, well, now I want it in 3 days, or now I want it in 2 days. I had one psychotic attorney who wanted it day of. Like you get out of review, they wanted it in their office that same day. So avoid the, yeah, that's all. Yeah, so avoid the insanity that could be triggered, put a number there. So this way, if some crazy person tries to argue for an abbreviated time period that's not feasible or practical, you can fight back and say, well, no, there was an agreement as to the timeline, right? And then we also know who's acting on their own, who's acting rogue. Because sometimes people, especially when you have so many people in a real estate deal, they have their own agenda. And they don't always do things checking with their client, right? They do it because it's convenient for them. 10. You just put the number 10. Or any time frame you want. But 10. Just don't leave it blank. Repeat the default.
You just put 10 days.
Right.
Correct. It's 10 days really from, this says from the date it's fully signed,
Right, which is,
but it doesn't matter because when you get through review, we reset all the timelines to run from the conclusion of attorney review. So if you say 10 days here, it resets with attorney review with 10 days from the conclusion of attorney review.
okay.
Make sense?
So just put the word in 10 days.
Or the number,
The number 10, that's
The
it.
number
Just the
10.
number 10.
just 10,
Number 10.
Mhm.
right? And again, if your deal had a quirk to it, where maybe the buyer wanted to provide it in 15 days and the seller agreed to it, you put 15 there. Or if the seller said for the only way this is gonna go forward is if you produce it in 5 days, then you put 5 days there. Correct.
Factual, otherwise just put the 10.
Otherwise, just put the 10 as your default. Right?
And I always say that experienced agents, the more that it's filled in, the more comfortable they are moving forward with you. The less that's in there, they feel you're inexperienced, right? So
Exactly.
it does look better if you fill in more so than not.
There you go. Now, letter C is who holds the money. Rule of thumb, seller's attorney. I don't see this as much anymore, but there was this weird time period where buyers were very perturbed that their agent, because they're the ones filling it out, put down seller's attorney. So if you feel you have that kind of client, put down buyer's attorney. That has changed tremendously in attorney review anyway. And also, I'm seeing a lot of seller attorneys who do not want to hold the deposit anymore. Attorneys go through audits on their trust account. They want to avoid an audit. So you don't know, you might get away with the buyer's attorney.
Something if you represent a buyer,
Yeah.
better to put the seller's attorney.
No, not necessarily. It depends on your buyer. If you think your buyer is going to feel alienated, if you put seller's attorney, just put buyer's attorney down. Right? It's marketing. Because when they see that, your buyer, they're like, why did my agent want my money to go to the seller's attorney? And the mental thought process is staggering after that, but it somehow alienates you from your own client. So don't run that risk. If you want, just as a matter of marketing, put down buyer's attorney. And in attorney review, it can switch over to seller's attorney,
Okay.
but that's not your problem at that point. Your hands are clean. You see what I mean? All right. Now, letter D, this is about the mortgage. And if you scroll to about the middle of it, scroll. If you let your eyes travel down to about the middle of it, you're gonna see some boxes that you have to fill in and some lines. Where it says principal amount, that's the amount of the mortgage. This should match what you put on the first page as mortgage. And then type of mortgage is hugely important. Is it VA, FHA, Section 203, conventional or other? When I say hugely important, it really matters which way you're traveling. If you say it's a FHA loan, and then you later convert it to conventional, nobody's gonna care, people will celebrate. Because conventional is easier to deal with. But if you try to go the other way, conventional FHA, that is, a pathway of broken glass. So
Very
Yeah.
treacherous, very treacherous.
treacherous, bloodied, people will be screaming when it's over. Because FHAs are harder to deal with and they have greater requirements. So if you have an FHA loan or a VA loan, make sure that's noted here. I haven't seen many 203K loans recently, but you should be aware of that. Those are construction loans, right? You actually, with the 203K loan, you're going above the purchase price.
Let me, question. If the buyer switches from conventional to FHA,
Mhm.
can the seller then say, I want out of this deal?
I should think so.
I've been doing this for 20 years and I've had 3 real estate deals go to court. 3, which is a very low percentage. One of them was my buyer who switched from conventional to FHA and didn't bother to tell anyone. The seller refused to sign. To go right to your question, I think this is breach of contract. My argument was, no, I mean, if it is a breach, it's a very minor one and substantial compliance wins. You just need to sign some paperwork saying you didn't give my guy a loan. This escalated because the seller refused to sign. His attorney quit because the seller didn't want to do his attorney, and I sued the seller. Because my guy wanted the property. Got into court, and the judge, who looked like an angry Santa Claus, awarded me everything, including attorney fees. So, can the seller say it's a breach? Yes. Do I internally think they have grounds for it? I do actually think they have grounds to say no. But that's not the agreed upon terms. But if you produce a commitment as a buyer and you get an angry Santa Claus judge, you might win. Like that. And you may have to even pay the other attorney his fees.
What if?
Yeah.
They switch and FHA needs a whole bunch of stuff done?
So that's a different story.
Okay.
Now that's a true breach,
Okay.
right? Because it was never agreed that the seller has, the only caveat is if the
Mm.
buyer says, I'm willing to make the repairs,
That's-
I'll do it out of my own pocket. And maybe you can get away with it, but it's a maybe, because you've really changed the contour of this.
Right.
And for you as a buyer to go onto somebody else's property to make repairs to get a loan, I think you're crossing a line. I don't think the court's gonna agree with that. You see what I mean? Because you're asking to manipulate somebody else's property at that point.
Wait, it has to get to that point.
Exactly.
On that point, I was gonna say when buyers offer, which they often do, I'll pay for, whatever, and I'll come do it, whatever.
Mhm.
So if the deal falls apart, then what happens with the money they've invested? in that property,
lose
that's not right.
It's
So,
on call.
no, I
but-
understand that, but I just.
But
wanna
the
make
seller
sure,
has to
you know.
agree to that, because if you're a seller and you entered into a contract with a conventional loan in this current market, and now your buyer switched to FHA, it's an opportunity loss. Maybe you wouldn't have selected that buyer if you knew they had an FHA loan. Maybe you would have taken a lower purchase price at conventional, just to save yourself time, aggravation, and repairs. You see what I mean?
Happens to the money in this property.
Oh, that's gonna be held until you come to a settlement or a court order. The buyer won't get that back for a while. They probably won't lose all of it though. Just what's the amount of damage? Now, if the court is cruel to the buyer and awards the full amount the seller could get in theory, they could lose all of it. Because what a buyer becomes responsible for if they lose is price deficiency, carrying costs until it's sold, additional attorney fees, additional court costs if there's a court proceeding,
Hmm,
right?
Okay.
All the additional expenses due to their breach is attributed to the seller. So, for most of these, frankly, it's settled.
Is the buyer doing that just to get the house? Because conventional sounds better, FHA.
Yeah.
Is that sometimes their intention?
That is definitely their intention. Yeah, because this market, any edge you have, you want to apply. I mean, I understand where it's coming from, but you still can't lie to get your way. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the risk the buyers take. Now, so you have to complete that section over here, and I will stress, it's pretty important that you get the type of loan to be accurate and it's put in here. The term of mortgage is normally 30 years, 30-year payback cycle. Sometimes buyers do 15, so you put 15 if it's a 15-year loan. But however long that's gonna go, it's going to be 30.
But does it, again, it doesn't matter.
That one is not a material, whether you put 15 or 30, right? What's more
It's
material
which
than
in
that?
the middle, it doesn't. matter.
Nobody cares. So again, the lender may say, I need an addendum, so it matches the contract. But I can't imagine any seller caring as long as they get the money at the end of the day. And with monthly payments based on a blank year payment schedule, there'll be a 30-year payment schedule or a 15-year payment schedule correlating to the term of the loan. Make sense? Now, as you go further down, that blank in there, this is your mortgage contingency period. If you don't put anything there, it defaults at 30 days. 30 days to me is pretty tight. I like to put 35 or 45. I think 45 in this market, again, I wouldn't necessarily put that because it may alienate a seller if they see that. So I'll probably put 35. But if you leave nothing in there and you just want to go with the default, then you put 30. Make sense?
If you have 30 day close, would you do it as close to the closing date as usually happens?
I would try. I'd put like 27 or 21 or something
Right.
like that. But frankly, when you have a 30-day close and you have a mortgage, most attorneys, if they've been doing this long enough, they're gonna blow out some of their time. We're probably gonna say a 45-day close and a 30-day period for the mortgage. You see what I mean? If they know what they're doing. If they don't know what they're doing, that'll be fun. So as you go further down, letter E, balance the purchase price. That is your closing date. And it's kind of the weird spot where they put it. Make sure you fill this out. Letter E is your trigger point for figuring out when you serve a time of essence letter for attorneys. So whatever anticipated date of your closing is in there, you want to put that here. Keep it realistic. The fastest I've ever closed a deal is about 15 days, maybe 10. Cash deal, ready to go, no inspection, right? Those are fantastic, but really rare. The average turnaround time is about 45 to 60 days, right? And your biggest time determinant, lending. It all comes down to the money. So if the buyer has money and is ready to go, you can close. So adjust an account for your lending period. Make sense?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, fire away.
With all my
I
questions.
love it.
Okay, so you have a client that has, that's gonna be using, bank A.
Mhm.
And they get the mortgage commitment from bank
Bank
A
A.
and send it on over. And then they decide, I don't want bank A, I want
Yeah.
bank B.
Yeah.
And they switch over to bank B. Do they have to tell the other side that that they have now changed?
Debatable. So two things come up. There's a practical component to this. If they're conventional, Bank B is gonna send another appraisal out there. So you're gonna want to tell your seller why there's another appraisal coming
But there's
back
no
out there.
appraisals in them.
Then you may not have to inform them. Because by bank A giving the mortgage commitment, you've completed the contingency. So if you don't process bank B in time, the seller can say, close at bank A. You see what I mean?
Okay.
I would inform them as a practicality statement, because I like that level of transparency.
Yeah.
And it doesn't hurt to tell the seller what's going on. So you might get like greater cooperation if you need more time. You see what I mean? Whereas if you just kind of slip in bank B, some people feel like you're pulling a fast one. Make sense? All right, as we keep going down, paragraph 4, like nothing to fill out on these paragraphs. 4 and 5, just so you know what they are. 4 is saying is that, what it's saying is that the buyer, they have enough liquidity coupled with the mortgage to actually buy the property. Right? In other words, they're not coming in knowing this is beyond their reach. Paragraph 5 is saying that the sales price is accurate. This is an aside. If you're from India, I don't think any of you seem to be. The way we work in India is a lot different from here. I know where paragraph 5 comes from. In India, you actually have two components. You have what's called white money and black money. And the government's been trying to get rid of black money since, I don't know. The black money is a non-reported amount that is just given like cash under the table, utterly non-reported. The white money is what you see on the contract. So paragraph 5 in the US to me is like, we don't want any under the table dealings. It's also noting that this sales price is going to the IRS we're reporting. So it keeps it on the level. Make sense?
No money in a paper bag.
Exactly. That's what we say in America.
Show up my office, $100,000 cash.
Mm.
I'm like, what are you doing? And he's like, whoa, cash. I'm like, that's not them. People, the strangest thoughts. You know? So paragraph 6, you want to fill out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Didn't even ask for a receipt. Just, dude, I left it with your receptionist. I'm like, are you crazy?
I don't have a receptionist.
It's terrible.
Funny.
So paragraph
They were
6,
not from here originally.
Mhm.
they've been here 30 years. There's no excuse for that. You know, you better know how it works here. You've been here that long. You know? So, no, they were like in their 50s. Like, there was no excuse for it. I'm just looking at them like
How they do
crazy.
business.
Yeah, seriously. So paragraph 6, this and 7 can lead to weird arguments that can derail you at the end. So make sure they're completed in full. What paragraph 6 is saying is what is included in the sale. Keep in mind, as a rule of thumb and as a matter of law, fixtures are always included unless deliberately excluded. What's a fixture? It's something fixed to the wall or to the ground. Take a bookshelf. Imagine it built into the wall, right? You have shelves and they're just hammered in. That's a fixture. Can't take that so. But imagine a bookshelf that's freestanding. You can just kind of shift it around, do what you want to do with it. That is not a fixture, not included. You see what I mean? The arguments I see the most on, again, a little bit diminished right now, TVs. They're hanging TVs,
Right.
right? The TV itself is not a fixture, but the frame technically is the thing you hung it on. So most people don't want people's like TV brackets, but I've had people argue for them.
What about ring doorbells, Nest, thermostats, all those things?
Yeah.
That's, I've heard that
But I would exclude them.
you have a subscription to them, so they're a personal.
They're personal,
Yeah.
but they are fixed to the property.
Right.
And a lot of buyers coming in when they see all the tech, that was part of the thing that drew them to the property,
The smart home.
the smart home stuff. Yeah. So if you're gonna take your ring, if you're gonna take your Nest, I would put it at paragraph 7. 7
Make
is
sure you
noting
ask
what's
your clients
included.
this. If you're working with a seller and you notice these things, ask them, are they looking to take it? So you make sure that you have everything.
Correct. It's really important because
Yeah.
you find at the end, that's when all the pettiness comes out.
Mm-hmm.
You're nearing the finish line and you do not want to be derailed by a thermostat.
Because.
You know. No, it's very frustrating. You're sitting there, I once said, no, like, you're not buying a thermostat, you're buying a house. I mean, try to take a more global picture here. But I also understand it. You came in thinking you're getting something and now you don't get something. Right? But put it in here, keep that clear. The articles include or exclude playground sets. That's another one. You know, I had one person ask about a storage shed, not like a shed where you put a lawnmower, like a little shed, you know, what I mean, like a little, it's almost like a storage bin. That's a better way to put it. You know what I mean? So any doubt in your mind whether the buyer might want it, you should talk to your seller and delineate it. Washer, dryer, refrigerator are your three most
Oh,
common.
it's not on there at all. I'm thinking as for a buyer's agent. And we see a ring doorbell or we see this thermostat, we should include it
I would
on
include it.
the,
You want to keep it crystal
on the
clear
contract.
in the beginning. So at the end, you're not fighting over this stuff. Yeah. You want to include stuff like that.
Cause they always get mad
Stoves.
at you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And depending how your inspection went, these really become hot points. Right?
Right.
And
I know.
inspection nowadays, you don't get much at all. So they're all clawing for stuff.
Another one is that hanging chandelier, where they have a beautiful hanging chandelier. People are buying it for the chandelier because it's
Yeah.
so gorgeous.
But
Then they come back at the walkthrough. and it's
nothing
not
there. That is a light fixture.
Oh,
That
Man.
is included technically.
But she's putting.
Your hanging chandelier that you love.
But the
Staying.
dining room chandelier is gonna be negotiable.
I mean, we had a deal that got out of review about a week ago. Clients went in thinking they were getting 3 hanging fixtures plus an outdoor grill. None of that was included. So we worked it out in attorney review, and I'll tell you, the buyers were upset, but they proceeded. But had that come up at the end, as opposed to the beginning, that would have been a nightmare. That would have been a real nightmare. So it's
How
good.
did
to be
it work
clear.
out?
Buyers capitulated. Because there was 8 other offers on it.
Oh,
If you want it, you know, what I mean, if you want the property, go for it. But what you don't want to do is have all this mudslinging at the end. Fingers pointing, hot emotions, you know what I mean? Clear it out in the very beginning. Now, as you go further down, paragraph 8. Paragraph 8. There's a blank there, and that's where you can select your title company if you want to. I mean, if you're working here, I would tend to think you're gonna put record title in. All right, but just so you know, 8 is customarily deleted by attorneys, not because of the title provision. Paragraph 8 is saying that every date in this contract is a hard date, and if you cross it, it's a breach of contract or a waiver. Nobody likes that, so we all delete this. That's why when you're done with attorney review, all your dates, whether it's your closing date, mortgage date, inspection, whatever date, they're all estimated dates. So if you go past them, there's not an immediate penalty. Make sense? One thing, by the way, I tell every buyer, whatever date you have in here as your closing date, add 15 days to it. And that's when your rate lock should expire. So if your contract is April 15th, your rate lock should expire on May 1st. Because you're not going to close on April 15th. The rule of thumb is that you're going to go past that by roughly a week.
We're laughing because we had a client using a horrible mortgage company. And they put a rate lock as 3 weeks prior to this.
Prior.
Prior. That's why I'm laughing at that.
Yeah. No, I've raised as many buyers as I can with that. Yeah.
It's all on the same day.
Yeah. Wow. Can't be. There's a lot of characters out there. So now paragraph 9, this is about your CO.
Oh.
This,
Yeah.
if you're the buyer's agent, you might be better off leaving it blank. If you're a seller's agent, you better make sure it's filled in. So the blank in here is saying that up to 1.5% of the purchase price is the amount the seller is obligated to spend to get the CO. That is a very large value. You know, if you're dealing with $1 million property or even a $500,000 property. The rule, or not rule, but the rule of thumb that most attorneys deal with for CO, it ranges between 500 to 1,500. So if you're a seller, you want to put down the seller's obligated to spend up to maybe 750 to get the CO. If it goes above 750, the seller can ask the buyer to contribute. That's what that means. Or they can just make up the difference.
Where are you? Where it says buyer selects?
Paragraph 9, this one.
Oh, over here.
Yep.
So what was your answer?
So if you're seller, you want to see a range between 500 to 1,500 there. If you're buyer, this might be the only blank you may want to leave. But then you'll obligate the seller to spend a large amount to get the CO.
It's a buyer that's filling this out.
I know. So you'll see the blank.
Oh,
But if you're talking to the other agent, if the other agent is a colleague, someone you like, you may not want to leave a blank. That's what I'm telling you.
And let the lawyer tell you.
Let the look, I'll tell you. I'm seller's attorney, I make sure there's a value that comes in here. Right, but not every sales attorney puts it in there. Yeah.
So on line 138, are we supposed to?
Yes. Your discretion, if you want a particular title company, you should. You can also leave that one blank. Correct. It's okay. Paragraph 8 gets deleted in full anyway, so, but it's just that if you're filling out the contract and you want to put in as much as you can, you would put a title company there or a closing agent there. All right, paragraph 10, I don't know if you can really fill that out. It's for the seller, it's there's an assessment or not. It might be worth asking the other agent, or if it's in the listing, you can put it in if it's already in the listing.
Right.
But if you don't know, just leave it blank. Now, paragraph 11 is about title. All right, and you see the one little blank on the next page? That's the type of home, a single family or a multi-development. Right? It's not a condo. Don't put condo family dwelling. I've seen that a bit. All condos, or not all, but condos can be single family or they can be multi-family. Most condos that I've dealt with are single family. All right, but don't put condo. Make sense? No. What paragraph 11, by the way, is describing is that the seller needs to provide the property without liens, debts, or encumbrances and marketable title. So if there's a title condition on the property, the seller has to cure it. That's what this paragraph is saying. Now, paragraph 12. This is just saying that the buyers can take the property once they close. So basically, there's no tenants. This is letter A. Possession and occupancy. Letter B, you would check mark that if there's tenants on the property who are staying after closing. Right? If the tenant is moving out before then, just put not after. Do you see what I mean? This is only if it's a continuing leasehold for the buyer to deal with after the tenant. Right, and if they are staying, you felt this little chart. Tenant's name, location means unit number or floor. The amount of rent is obviously the amount of rent, security deposit, and term is the total number of months on the lease. All right,
Not what's left.
not what's left, the whole thing. It's a little confusing though, and you don't want to let anyone sort of get misguided by this. So what I'd like to do is whenever I actually fill out contracts, is I actually say, here's a lease agreement, you'll see it. I verify with my client, of course, that the rent and the security deposit are accurate in there. And then I'll just say, see attached lease. So if you don't want to fill this out, get the lease. Attach it.
Couldn't you also put months on lease and then underneath it say?
You can make a
3
little
months
chart.
remaining?
You could definitely do that.
Yes.
But my thing is, look, when you're filling this out, every line you put in here is more liability for you. So the more that you can sort of say, see reference, see attached, the better off you are. Make sense? All right, lead paint. This is getting more and more important nowadays. So paragraph 13, if it's pre-1978, you say after the film. If it's after 1978, not after. Make sense? Good. Did everyone get pizza?
Yes, thank you.
No, gotta eat.
He's trying to be good boy.
No, I know.
No.
I actually respect that.
I know, me too.
I break down. when people-
Me too.
The letter C. This is saying that the buyer is allowed a 10-day calendar period for inspections. You see that right on top?
Yeah.
So that's a 10-day period for inspection. If you're gonna go more than that, like sometimes I see 15, sometimes you have unique sort of situations. That's where paragraph 43 comes into play. You would say that the inspection period is going to be X number of days if it's greater than 10 or less than 10. Make sense? Now, now, if you see that blank underneath that, this paragraph down here, this first blank, that's a time period for the seller to respond. So they get the report, they get a letter. If you don't put anything in there, they have 3 business days to respond. My writer gives them 5, just because practicality. You know, nobody gets it to me within 3 business days. But You can put in 3 if you want to. Keep in mind, any date you put in here is not truly binding. They're guidelines. So it might encourage people to respond faster. Right? And then the second blank you have is when the buyer responds to the seller's response, right? So 10 days for the first report to go out, then 3 days for seller to respond, then another 3 days for the buyer to respond if you leave it blank. But I would put a number there.
3 to 5.
Yeah, 3 to 5. All make sense so far? There was a point I wanted to bring this, but that's in paragraph 16. I'll get to that. Okay, as you go further down, paragraph 14, point of entry systems. Now, this is really referring to well water. So, to a degree, a POET system. So, if you have a water treatment in there that's kind of treating contaminants from a well, you put applicable here. Now, that being said, at paragraph 42, you have an addendum for it. It says well water addendum. So it's almost a redundancy. And the reason why that happened, that these contracts were about, I think it's about 4 years or maybe 3 years, they were all modified. That paragraph 42 with all those little addendum clicks, that wasn't there 3 years ago. But this was. So I think this was the old language in the realtor form. They never took it out. So you do have a redundancy, but just keep it consistent. If there's well water or some sort of treatment going on the property, just say applicable. All right,
So wait. So if there's no treatment, let's say,
not applicable.
but it's well, it's not.
I mean, if you have well water and you're drinking from it, then it's gonna be applicable. All well water is treated before you drink it. They go through that filter system. Yeah. So,
If it's contaminated or not, you would put,
no, so it's not whether it's contaminated. Is there a system that the water runs through before you drink it? You see,
filter.
a filter system of some sort to
But if you
remove the
just have
contaminant.
a well.
If
and
you just
your
have a well,
water,
and you're using it, yeah, if you're using that well water, let's say for gardening purposes, then you say not applicable. If you're using that well water to drink, applicable. All right, I've seen that. Actually, there's a good number of properties that have well water that's not in use, but they can use it for watering their garden. Yeah, exactly.
Like, the town really doesn't prefer you do that, but they do it.
They do it.
Yes.
They do it, and it's getting rare for what it's
Mhm.
worth. There was a time I saw them on both. But if you're drinking that water, applicable. If you're not drinking, not applicable. All right, cesspools, ask, it's very rare you're gonna deal with cesspools. But I would ask the seller, is there a cesspool? And if there is one, it'd be in the disclosure anyway. So you would just check mark this based on the MLS, if there's a cesspool or not. Cesspools, by the way, if there's one on the property, it has to be removed before you close. And that's on the seller for the most part. It is negotiable in theory, but it's like an oil tank. You can't have that there anymore. Like, it's actually worse than an oil tank. Oil tanks are not mandatory to be removed, right? Your market force is pushing you for the removal. There's no law saying you have to remove it, right? If you decommissioned it, in theory, you could accept it, which 7 years ago, that's what people just did. Nowadays, nobody will buy the property as a practicality. Cesspools go one further. There's a law on point. You have to remove that before you can go ahead and close. So you want to account for that because that's going to have a timing issue attached to it.
And that's one of those questions that you don't represent the seller. That's,
MLS.
yes. So you're counting on whatever that
Yes.
information is that's provided to you.
But when you're in Essex County, you don't have to take it out.
I think it's statewide,
It's state.
Yeah.
statewide cesspool,
no, cesspool, the other one.
the oil tank.
You don't have to take an oil tank out.
And anywhere in New Jersey.
But the market force is going to force you to do it,
Right.
right? Buyers
Fine.
don't want to buy one.
If your seller wants to actually sell.
So, or I have had sellers sell it, but tremendous discounts to the point where you're better off just removing it. Do you see what I mean? As a price point. But some people don't want to deal with it. I don't know why.
What you're gonna find when you take it out.
Whenever I do that price point reduction, I have a buyer doing that. Besides all the CYAs I give that buyer, it is a huge discount. It's huge. I mean, it's probably the amount I've gotten off of these contract prices is probably more than what remediation would have cost. Because that's how I have to account for it. I have to assume that you, a seller, are refusing from that oil tank because there's something wrong. So I'm gonna treat it like there's something wrong, and I'm gonna demand like upwards of $15,000 to $20,000 up. You see what I mean? And even then, I'm caveating, because
Yeah, you don't know.
you don't know, if it hit groundwater underneath, it could be a lot more than that.
Or your neighbor.
Well, it depends how much I like that neighbor. Yeah. So if you look at the bottom of the cesspool paragraph, this is it's setting forth who's responsible for the removal of that cesspool. Like I said, rule of thumb, seller, but it's negotiable. In this market, you could maybe force a buyer to do it. So if the seller is gonna remove it, it's number one, you would check mark. If the buyer is going to do it, it's number two, you're gonna check
You
mark.
don't need to, if it's not applicable, you don't. need
Then
to-
you don't fill out that, the rest of it. Yep. Most of the time, it's gonna be not applicable.
Yeah,
You don't see many of those. Yep. You find one, addendum. That's on the attorneys to make an addendum and resolve it. When you fill this out, it's with the information you have at that time, right? So the information you have comes from like one of three sources: direct negotiation, the MLS, or the seller's disclosure if you have them. Make sense?
So for instance, they don't mark it anywhere, so we don't know as a buyer's agent as we're preparing the contract.
But not applicable.
Right,
Yeah.
but there is one. Now we find out there is a cesspool.
Correct,
So then you,
As
as
the
the
attorney-
attorney, will address that.
correct.
Okay,
Technically, the seller made a misrepresentation.
right.
Now, it's hopefully a good faith one, but you don't want to leave it blank, because then you lose that argument to say, no, you knew and lied. You see what I mean?
And well has to be inspected before it's sold.
Oh, a private well, yes.
Yeah.
And that inspection is on the seller.
To test the
Yeah,
water.
to test the water.
There's two,
Yeah.
there's two parts to that. You have the seller is going to test the water to make sure that it is,
Potable. Mhm.
Okay.
and the other part is hiring. Buyer hires a well inspector,
Test the integrity.
right,
Right,
to test the integrity of the well, the pump, whatever,
everything.
the whole thing.
Little thing about that well test by the seller, there's two levels of it: primary contaminant, secondary. The law only says
Right.
primary. I ratchet it up to secondary, and maybe like 30% of the time I get away with it. Man, I hope I don't have you guys as sellers. Seeing right through me, but the point is,
We're making notes to
Making
tell you
notes.
what you're not going to do.
so like when you when you have fire, it's just something to note. Now, keep in mind the secondary contaminant, to address that, it's not a major cost. So that's why I don't mind if the seller pushes back and says primary. It's just, I'm trying my best for my client at that point, that's it. But it's just so you know, two levels, primary, secondary. Law says primary must be, must pass primary.
So the seller is responsible for testing the water,
Correct.
and that's it.
No, and having it pass primary. You
What?
have to pass the test.
Too old for this fucking stuff.
Terry
I hear it.
will take care of you. She'll lead you through.
If the secondary didn't pass and the water has some issues,
Mhm.
the seller needs to remedy
He
it.
needs to remedy
He
it.
needs to.
Yeah, at least up to primary.
Not at second.
Not
at
secondary, so
They don't
it's not
need to.
obligated.
It would be
Yeah.
lovely if they did.
Exactly.
Oh.
So remember, it now costs the seller $1,300 approximately for the test, where it used to be $300. It went up dramatically
Yeah.
after COVID, dramatically.
Because, yeah, exactly, because they could.
Because we're in New Jersey, I don't know.
So, just to keep it clear,
It's like 600.
if you have a seller and they have well water, they need passing water results of at least primary standard,
Okay.
okay? They have to present that. The results should be within a 6-month time period. Sometimes I've seen some lenders,
Mhm.
because lenders do look at that, ratchet it up to 3 months. Rare, but I've seen it every now and then. At least 6 months. Okay, make sense?
Makes sense. Mhm.
All right.
So do you have, I'm sorry, you have a seller
Mhm.
as well,
Yes.
saying to be anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Do you recommend that the seller have the water tested,
Oh,
have a certificate?
They have to.
Before you list the house?
no. Because you don't know when that closing date is. You see what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I would actually wait a little bit based on the timeline of your transaction. If you have a 60-day deal, then I would try to get it done in the first 15 days of the deal. I'd probably wait for the deposit to come in, maybe inspections to be done, because now you know you have a solid deal outside of the mortgage component. If you have a tighter deal where it's like a 30-day turnaround or the attempt, I would just run with it. Because that test is good for 6 months. So if that buyer fails, I will probably get another buyer, again, given the lack of inventory, and close within the 6 month time period.
You don't know how long it's gonna take for the company to, right, to get back.
Well, they normally take about 3 to 5 business days, give or take. Right?
They come and they take the wood.
They come, they take a sample, bring it to their lab, email you the results. The only thing is
If it
about
doesn't
schedule.
pass,
Then it might take another maybe 2 to 7 days to
So it
remedy
doesn't, who makes it better?
the cell. They have, the same company that did the testing can repair it.
And
Yeah, it's not a conflict of interest.
it's not,
Not legally, but. Well, I mean, let's talk about practicality.
That's why people won't go for RE data a lot because they do
Yeah.
both, where Agra and Dover only test it and doesn't
Yeah.
It
It seems like
put a
So-
filter in or something.
you're encouraging stuff to fail when they're the ones repairing.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Anyway.
but if you're representing the buyer
yes.
and it has a secondary didn't pass, what will be
So it
our
depends how
approach?
attorney review went. So in my review letter, I want them to address up the secondary. But if there's pushback and there's a compromise and we agree at primary, then up to primary. And the client, my buyer, should be aware of it before that point, because that was something raised and addressed in attorney review. Might have to remind them because memory is short, but then I'll just remind them like, look, you agreed for primary. That's right here. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay, paragraph 16. There's nothing for you to fill out here, at least on this page, but it's just something for you to know. This is your built-in inspection contingency. So these are all the things people can ask for. The thing that I'd like to point out will come on the next page, page 8. Before I get to the thing I'm going to point out, letter C is the first thing you're going to fill out. Now, letter C is specific for wood destroying insects.
Page 8.
Page 8, subsection C of paragraph 16. It's the first paragraph up there. Now, these are all timelines. If you don't put anything in there, 14 calendar days from the point of attorney review. That's your window for wood destroying insects. All right. Again, I wouldn't be too concerned about your timelines with inspection, because that is probably going to be negotiated in attorney review. The only time I'm really worried about it is if you put it at paragraph 43 and it was some sort of element in your deal being accepted. So everything you put in here, so the first blank, whatever time period you want for wood destroying insects, you would put that there. You put nothing there, it's 14 days. You could put 14 for the most part, right? You would have discrepancy though between general inspection and wood destroying insects, right? Because general is 10 days by contract. This is 14, but I don't think it's a major discrepancy.
Well, one is business days and one is.
I was just on.
No, the response
Oh.
is business days.
why did they do that?
To make it confusing.
Yeah.
That works. Yeah, I frankly don't like businesses. I like to put it down as calendar days for the most part. Because I think it's easier for the layperson to deal with calendar days than a bit. If you told me on the street, you have 3 days to get something done, I'm gonna assume 3 calendar days. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So I try to avoid business days overall. But the contracts are the contracts.
So you include weekends.
Depends on the nature of the activity, but I account for them too. So if I'm gonna say 3 days and I mean 3 business days, I'm gonna give you 5 calendar days and I'm likely. You see what I mean? All right, now underneath that, just wanna see
7 days.
15, yeah. So that's 7 days. That's if people want to void it. So let's say, when I say void, I mean they want to cancel the contract and the seller is refusing to address it. So the 7 days here is really referring to the timeline the seller has to respond. Right? So if the seller doesn't respond in 7 according to this business days, then the buyer can say, you didn't respond, you're not going to cure it, I can cancel the deal. Again, I wouldn't get called up on this. This is going to be completely modified in attorney review. If there's one thing that almost every attorney does, it's play with the timelines for inspections. Now, paragraph 16, this one, what I want you to note beyond the blanks, look at that very first line. Buyer acknowledges that the property is being sold in an as-is condition. I get this argument a lot that the contract never said as is. It says it's right in the contract. But as is doesn't mean they won't make repairs. All as is means is that the seller is presenting the property without representation. In other words, you buyer, you need to go rely on your inspections to figure out the condition of the property. It doesn't mean the seller won't make repair if you find them. Just means they're not saying it's in great shape or bad shape. Do you see what I mean? So that phrase as is leads to so many problems because buyers interpret it for the most part as though the seller's not going to do anything. Right? They treat it like an as is, where is sale. That's not what this is. As is just means you need to rely on your own inspections. See what I mean? So if your buyer runs across this and this causes them to delay signing, you might want to throw that in. And say you can talk to the attorney about it, but as far as I know, as is just means without representation.
Kind of a stupid line to put in there.
No, it's really, Jersey is a buyer beware state. Like whatever you buy, you as a buyer, you need to do your own evaluations. Right? That's how we buy anything. You want to buy a car, go test drive it, do your own research. You want to buy a house, go do your own inspections, do your own due diligence. This is reiterating this basic concept. It's the term that has just been sort of badly connotated over the years. You see what I mean? I almost wish it just said being sold without representation would have been a better way to phrase this than saying in an as is condition. But as is a term of art. Every legal entity that I know, of any lawyer who sees that, if they've been doing this stuff with any kind of regularity, knows that it means without representation. Newbie attorneys might assume it means without inspection or without repair. But that's not what it means at all.
But that way in your not to see. All that is.
Yeah.
For everything.
Correct. Putting it back in there.
Are you representing something different?
So if an attorney never actually read the contract, which a surprisingly large number of attorneys have not. So they just, well, like they spiel out their writer, but they never read the form. So they're reiterating what's in there, or they're not that experienced. They might assume as is where is. When you see that phrase where is, as is, and where is, now that means they don't intend to make any kind of repairs. So that's probably what they mean. So when I see an attorney write to me as is, I clarify. I don't want to get into this and later find out what you meant was as is and where is, even though you only said as is. Because ultimately, whether or not you put that in there, the seller is not obligated to make repairs.
Then the agent.
I've seen them in both attorney review letters and agent remarks. And the problem is that people don't know what they're actually saying by it. Half the people know what it means, and they mean without representation. The other half means as is where is. And as is where is means that the seller will not make repairs. Right, so I like clarity when I see it specifically like listed in a listing or in an attorney review letter. I will look for clarity saying, what do you mean by that? And when I say I look for clarity, I define it for them. I will say that you mean that you're providing without representation, but I have all my inspection rights. Keep something in mind there.
Well, a famous thing was for years for realtors that we would put property being sold in as is condition except for structure.
So and so, yeah.
Are they still putting
I
those?
still put that in there, but see, when you say that, the whole thing is an as is condition. You see what I mean? It's almost redundant.
But sometimes the seller will say, I'm not doing anything.
That's fine, that's their right. So,
Where
well,
you say as is where.
what's happening with that phrase,
As.
yeah, contextually, it's very clear what that seller means that they don't intend to make repairs, except for structural, mechanical,
Right.
or what have you. But the way it's written is sort of in violation of the term of art, right? What they really wrote down is saying, I'm presenting to you without representation, but I will address structural, mechanical, blah, blah, blah. It's poorly written when they do that, but that's just the way things are done nowadays. So when you see that by context, you want more clarity, and that's what the review letter provides. Right? Just so you know, sellers are never obligated to really make repairs. They don't have to make repairs, and then if it's in the right genres that they don't make repairs within, the buyers can cancel. Right? No mandatory repair, no mandatory purchase. That's why it's an inspection contingency.
So if your sellers insist on not making it,
Is that right?
you really don't need to say or write anything.
You might want to make it very clear to the buyer that you're doing this for informational purposes.
Mm.
And so, look, there's a practicality to this beyond the The practicality of this is that you don't want to land into a deal, spend weeks running the deal just to have it canceled over something you knew was already there. Do you see what I mean? So when you see a seller say something like, I'm not gonna make repairs, it's definitely worth telling your buyer, they're not gonna make repairs. Keep that in mind as you do your inspection. So then your inspection doesn't become a point of credit negotiation or repair negotiation. It becomes a litmus test. Are you going forward or are you not? You see what I mean? Changes the mindset. And with that mindset being changed, it will save your deal. Because if you ask me as a buyer, I'm going in there and I think that you, seller, will make repairs if I find insect damage or mold. Do you see what I mean? And you don't do it, I'm gonna be really PO'd, right? I'm gonna maybe say, I don't want your property now. But if I went in there with the mindset knowing that, okay, they're not gonna make repairs, everything I'm evaluating is to make sure it's in my budget, completely different mindset.
Quick question, we just had this. If you have an inspection and the inspector says you have mold or you have this, that looks like it's mold, looks like it's asbestos. Who's responsible for the testing?
Well, it depends on the attorney review letter. So in theory, the buyer, most of the time, because due diligence falls on the buyer, right? So if the general report says there seems to be maybe toxic mold, you didn't establish that's toxic mold, buyer, go to a report. Hire somebody, establish it's toxic. And when I'm sales attorney, that's literally what I write down. You didn't establish it's toxic. There might be mold there, but it could just be run of the mill mold. That happens. You want to do more testing, you're free to do it, but we're not paying for it. The big one that I see in terms of like pushback, the investigative dig, if you find a metallic anomaly. So when you do a property sweep to find out, is there an oil tank, right? They just walk around with a metal detector and they can maybe figure out dimensions, but you didn't establish that's an oil tank. So if I'm seller and you come to me and say, I think you have an oil tank, I'm like, that's great. I think you need to do an investigative dig at your cost, right? Because you didn't establish it's an oil tank as a buyer. Now, if I'm buyer, I'll take a completely different tactic. But the point is, the attorney review letter establishes that more clearly. But if it's not delineated or clarified explicitly, it's on the buyer as part of their due diligence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's pretty.
Okay, so several situations where if something comes up and every single time it has not been an oil tank.
Mhm.
Old stove and a whole.
We once found a whole pool submerged under the ground, like they just dumped land on it. It was fantastic. Correct.
Because if the sellers think no, I mean, especially if it's a great deal, then the buyer can just walk away. And
Correct.
then you've already lost 2 or 3 weeks, and is it really worth that $500?
It's a judgment call. Of course
So
it
you
is.
might as well just.
It's a negotiable factor per deal. I've had it go either way. It depends how hot the property is. Now, if you have like 8 people behind this buyer who are willing to go ahead and do the dig, the buyer's gonna capitulate if they want the property. Do you see what I mean? So it's really per deal. There's no magic bullet as to procedure on it.
So if they
Yeah.
say they think it's an oil tank, you can really say to the buyer,
You didn't establish that's an oil tank.
Huh?
Like you didn't establish buyer, it's an oil tank. You can do a dig. I grant you permission to do a dig. See what I mean?
yeah, see, I had the sellers pay for the darn thing, was a stupid toilet under the driveway.
I was gonna make a toilet joke, but it's utterly inappropriate. But, so, but like, it's negotiable, and honestly, it depends on your deal, the cooperation between the parties, the entire feel of it. So it depends who I'm dealing with, depends how the clients have been, depends on the other inspection requests. Like if my buyer put out a laundry list of requests.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? Like, it depends what angle you're coming at that time. You gotta tailor it.
But they can't, if someone's gonna test for an oil tank, I mean, can't they just get away with saying, we think it's an oil tank, or should they know it's an oil?
Well, they won't know by just the metallic anomaly.
Right, so these
have to get a
buyers,
dig.
these sellers are paying for this guy,
That's
and
fine.
he's not necessarily gonna give them a yes or a no answer.
If you do the dig, you will know. But now you're uncovering that metallic thing, you will find out what's there. So you will know by the dig. You may not know just by a property sweep. The property sweep just tells you it's very indicative or not.
It's something.
Right. And you also, they also tend to look at vent pipes and connections to the building. Now, if you see all these pipes coming out of the building and a vent, I mean, it's probably an alt. Right? But if there's no piping and there's just some sort of metallic thing in there, could be a toilet.
They may want to take it
Yeah.
on anyway.
Yeah.
Very well, like an old
The
Yeah.
gray water tank.
gray water tank, and
Mhm,
it wasn't even in any of the town records
No.
Yeah.
that it was there.
They just covered it up.
But, yeah,
Mhm.
There you go.
it actually had been removed, it was just the tank.
It's
Yeah,
weird stuff
yeah.
in the ground. Like I said, my favorite one is that somebody didn't want their pool anymore. So they covered the whole thing up with just dirt and leveled out the property and built like some sort of structure over it.
Oh.
Fast forward 20 years, you do that sweep, all the metallic connections underneath were still there. It triggered the metal detector. They uncovered it and now the buyer got a pool. You know, they wanted the pool back. I mean, it was amazing. So they were able to uncover it all back, get permission from the town, of course.
Wow.
And now they have a built-in pool. I don't know what condition it was in.
I was gonna say, what could it be?
Yeah.
with that?
But it wasn't that bad for repair. Like you had to do some repair, but not as much as you think.
No,
Not as much as costing.
Yeah, it's putting one in.
That's one.
So, you know, fantastic for those guys.
Mhm.
No,
Nice.
What did you add, Mark?
letter E and F is talking about responsibility to cure and flood hazard. Again, there's nothing to really fill in there. And then as you keep going down, letter G, just so, again, I'm just calling for your attention, you should be using a qualified inspector. So sometimes people, let's say my general contractor will be coming with me, or my uncle who once built a birdhouse is gonna come with me. Those are not qualified technically. They're licensed inspectors who should be coming. That is defined by the contract. All right. So water quality, again, this is representation that the seller has made no representation as to water quality. It's on you, Bar, to go ahead and evaluate everything. Same thing with
Wait,
17.
but I thought it's the seller that has to test
They
it.
have to test it, but they didn't make a representation when you entered contract.
Okay.
This is really more applicable for public water,
Oh.
not so much well water. Right. Now, Megan's Law, we're all familiar with that one, right?
Yeah.
Right. With that one, if it does come up in attorney review letters, what I tend to do is I direct the buyer to check it out at the county website. There's, on the county website, we'll have a list of offenders and they can do what they want to do for information.
I think it's on here too.
I didn't see
It
it.
used to be, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, www.njsp.org.
Is it blending in? I don't-
Oh, it's on the next one, after the law registry,
Oh,
registry,
okay.
that's why.
There
it's
it
not-
is. Perfect. Now 19 is about off-site conditions. This is just saying that, let's say you're doing something construction-wise with a house, you have to send out a 200-foot radius notice. You know what I'm talking about? So whenever you do something, you need permission from the town that's gonna involve construction. You're obligated to notify all your neighbors within a certain radius. That's what this is referring to, that the seller hasn't received any kind of notice of that nature.
Oh, okay.
With their neighbors within.
Yep.
Okay.
Now 20, and this is, I like this one, because I think secretly want to be a pilot. But this tells you all the airports in which towns, and the reason why they're disclosing this to you is that, you know, airplane traffic, the noise. So, no buyer can ever come back to you and say, you didn't tell me there's an airport nearby in this. So. I had one person try to argue once about electrical lines, not an airport. They're trying to say that they didn't know there was an electrical substation a few blocks away.
Mhm.
And I remember talking to them like, there's only one way to get to your house. It's off that road. So did you never visit the property? I mean, is that your argument? I mean, I'll make that argument to the seller if that's what you want me to do. But I just want to clarify it. And he actually never visited the property for real, with a sight unseen purchase. And he only found out, I guess, like 20 days into the deal. Seller was angry, but I got him out. So, right? But can't do that with airports. So,
They
Site?
ask if you've seen, if your seller
Yeah.
has been, or the buyer has seen the property.
and I kind of agree with it, because no matter how much you do by Zoom or video or whatever, you don't really know, the noise level of the property. You don't know how to get there. You don't know the neighborhood. And these are determining factors for buyers. Might cause you to go to a rupture if they've never seen. Now, 21, bulk sales. This one comes up if you're dealing with income producing properties. Right? So residential properties, even if they are income producing, that are directly owned by one person or a married couple, this doesn't apply.
So basically, the
Doesn't, if you're doing
LLCs,
residential
I
real
believe.
estate, yeah, LLCs, this is an instant trigger point. The state of New Jersey wants to know if you are selling a property that's income producing and they want an escrow. And if you don't comply with the bulk sales notification, then they can hold the buyer accountable for the seller's tax liability. So it's pretty severe. Doesn't really affect you guys, but it only affects you in one way. If you see the LLC as a seller, not as a buyer, but as a seller, and you don't see any emails about bulk sales, you may want to shoot a note out 15 days before closing. The reason why is that most title companies are fully aware of this. And if they don't produce, when I say they, the buyer, if they don't produce the bulk sale notice from the state, they will delay your closing until the notice comes. And if you mail that to the state of New Jersey, it takes 10 business days for them to get back to you. So it's a long period of time.
takes time.
Right? It could cause a delay if not filed. All right, now 22. This is about insurance. And this is just a little heads up to the buyer that the mortgage provider will require insurance. Again, I don't think it really comes up too much because most mortgage lenders will tell their buyers that, but it's also in the contract. 23 is saying the seller will maintain the property in substantially the same condition from the offer to the closing. Correct? Risk of loss. What that means is that if something happens that's catastrophic on the property, fire, asteroid, Kardashians, whatever, it's on the seller because they're still the owner of them. Right? This one is very haunting when you deal with use and occupancy, by the way. Because at that point, the seller is no longer the owner. And let's say the roof falls down or something breaks while they're under the UNO. Who's responsible? Technically the buyer at that point. They're the owner. And the tenant is like the seller is a pseudo tenant, right?
Oh.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they sold it. That's why they're under a UNO.
Right.
So it's just, again, nothing to do, just calling to your attention for their background. Now, the contract calls for 2 walkthroughs, not one. And it used to be before COVID hit, you would go about 10 days before, then again, maybe 1 day before. That left a period of time to deal with any kind of walkthrough issues. After COVID, you reverted back to the way it was before, which is 1 walkthrough, and it stayed that way. But just so you know, contractually speaking, the buyer has the right for 2 visits. Right? Nobody really stands on it. 26, adjustments. What this is referring to is prorating all the expenses to the closing date, property tax, you know what I mean, like things of that nature. Yeah, nothing much to do with that. There's a little note at the last of this part, at the last paragraph of this part, which I find good. And this is just noting the seller has to provide certain tax forms, 1099 and FERPTA. Again, doesn't apply so much for your day to day. 27 is just saying if people reach the contract, these are their rights. I don't put too much time on 27 in this contract. Attorneys rewrite this all the time. What we all say is that you have your rights at law and at equity, meaning you can sue each other for money or you can sue each other to enforce the contract. Make sense? 28. This is just saying they got your consumer information statement. I
Is that
think we're all
true or
good.
not, people? Is that true or not? Are you giving it to them is my question. That was the
hope so.
question. I
Yeah.
brought it up this week. I brought it today.
Now, 29 is a part you really want to fill out. This is, well, it's not 29, it's gonna be a little further down. But 29 is saying if there's any kind of affiliated services. All right. So it's saying that the broker has a business relationship with so-and-so. And then 30 is where you fill in your particular information as a realtor. Yours and the other agents. When you're filling that part out, my suggestion, always put your email there at the very least, always. Because when I write my attorney review letter and I need to figure out the email addresses of the agents because I include the agents, This is where I'm looking to find it. Equitable lien, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Every attorney deletes it. What your contract is saying, if there was no attorney review, is that if the deal falls apart or the buyer cancels, but you felt like your effort still entitled you to payment, you could put a lien on the property by 31. No attorney permits that. It's always deleted. All right, 32. This is a disclosure that if you were buying the property for yourself, for example, that you are a real estate agent. You have to disclose that as a matter, I think, of realtor ethics. All right. 33. This is permitting you to get a copy of the closing statement at closing. You will find some old school attorneys out there who do not want to give you a copy of your CD, of your HUD or anything. But contractually, unless they deleted it, they're obligated to give it to you. All right, so they're going to be a breach of contract if they don't provide.
Years ago, we had an attorney that didn't. Because
Yeah. I run across them down this.
Attorney said, don't worry about it.
Yeah, just give them. The problem now that they broke it up though, the buyer CD and seller CD, you need a copy of seller CD, but that's the one that shows your commission. Either that or an alternate.
I think they're often.
That's fine. That's the information you need then.
Yeah.
But you need something that goes with your check. Yeah.
I mean,
They're still out there. They're still out there. I run across them now. Now, 34.
Lance?
Sure.
Going back to 32.
Yeah.
If the real estate agent is part of an LLC, is that still? Yeah.
So if they're part of an LLC,
So if they're buying the property. as
Are they
an
licensed?
LLC,
I would still disclose it.
Yeah, if you're licensed, yes.
Yeah,
Well,
I would
Yeah, it
recommend
doesn't matter
I
what you're
would note-
buying it under.
that you're
Okay.
like a member of the LLC and that you have a license. Just because with ethical boards, they don't want the ability to bypass that disclosure so easily circumvented. Otherwise, everybody would just form an LLC and circumvent it. Make sense? All right, 34 about professional referrals. This is saying you're referring people like inspectors, contractors, attorneys, but you're not vouching for their services, right? This is a disclaimer that protects you. Now, 35, everyone gets a little confused on this. The attorney review. The attorney review clause. You have 3 days to enter attorney review. This says you have 3 days to resolve attorney review. The reason why it's really 3 days to enter review is that when you enter attorney review, you're not under contract. So every contractual term, including the one that says you have to resolve it in 3 days, is no longer enforceable. So don't be fooled by you must resolve within 3 days. It's not binding once attorney review starts. Does that make sense? But you do have to start it in 3 days. All right, I've had deals where they've come to me on the 4th day. Technically, I can't do attorney review. And I've had some sticklers who are like, we're not gonna let you, and I have to make equitable arguments, and it gets crazy. Right?
Well, in South Jersey, the 3rd day, you're out of attorney review because you don't use
They don't use
attorneys.
attorneys. Yeah. All right. 36 is about notices. How do you communicate with each other? Don't give it much weight. Every attorney changes this. We all like email. That's what it really comes down to. The assignment, where it says no assignment. So let's say you have buyer Y, and they really want to later assign it to their company, or they're going to give it to some other buyer. That's an assignment. This is saying you can't do that without permission. Make sense? So if you're going to have a buyer who's purchasing it with the intent of assigning it to their company later on, there should be a clause in attorney review permitting them to do that. Otherwise, technically, they have to buy it in their personal name. 38 is letting you use DocuSign in a nutshell. 39, this is only if you're dealing with companies. So when a company goes to buy or sell, you need a resolution. It's a formal statement saying the company is going to do so-and-so action. And this is in here that it's a requirement for them to do that and provide that if necessary. All right, and 40, keep in mind, let's say you have a huge conversation about how inspection works with the other side, about how the contract of the deal will go, but you don't put it in writing, and then you still sign the contract. That whole conversation, you cannot rely on it. The only thing binding is what's in writing in this agreement when you present it to everyone. That's what 40 is saying. This is the entire agreement.
Okay, let me ask you a question.
Mhm.
We just had, our client wanted us to put all this verbiage in about the basement floor. in the contract. And we thought it would be like a red flag.
Mhm.
So we said, well, instead of doing it in a contract, let's
Do it in
email
review.
it.
Okay,
Let's, and have it done in attorney review.
okay.
That he originally really wanted it in the contract and we're like, I'm
So,
afraid that the mortgage
Yeah.
company would be like,
well, okay, we'll talk about mortgage in a minute. 40 is a little bit misleading. Because this is your entire agreement when you sign, but by the time you're done with review, this is not your entire agreement. Your entire agreement will be this, plus the letters that comprise attorney review. What it really means, 40, is that you don't trust verbal communication. Everything in the agreement should be in writing, whether it's in this contract or the attorney review letter, it's fine. But it needs to be in writing. That's what it comes to. Make sense? Now, with mortgage and what have you, be very careful. Because if you're trying to not disclose something to the mortgage lender, you just don't want to run afoul of mortgage fraud. You see what I mean?
well, it's not, it's, he was concerned about if the basement floor was 4 inches.
For 3 inches, all right, client sounds a little particular.
Yes, exactly.
No.
And he wanted
Yeah.
that on the contract and we're like.
No.
Right.
The mortgage guy probably won't care. That sounds like your client just cared deeply about it.
Yeah.
But that being said, yeah, that's an attorney review clause or a should never be in a contract clause. So one or the other. Now, 41 is about governing law. Obviously, we're controlled by New Jersey. Something to note, if you deal with co-ops, have any of you dealt with them? No.
Really?
Co-ops are like the redhead, no redheads in there. The redheaded stepchild of law when it comes to real estate. Co-ops, nobody really likes them in New Jersey and nobody is that familiar with them. There's a couple. I've done a whole bunch of co-ops. The problem with co-ops is most attorneys grab the New York document. There's a New York form template that almost 80% of the attorneys use when they're dealing with co-ops. The problem with that template is that it says governed by New York law and situated in New York. So if you ever run across a co-op, just something to keep in mind, if you see that form co-op contract appear, just make sure someone's like converting it to Jersey. Again, not so much your lookout as much as the attorney, but something just in the back of your mind to keep an eye on. That's really everything, by the way. Bunch. If you go to Jersey City, there's a bunch over there. I know there's a spattering of co-ops in Hackensack, more near the hospital. In Morris Plains, I know there's a bunch. Not Plains, sorry, Morristown, sorry, I misspoke. Exactly right. Yeah, I run across it like maybe every 15th deal is a co-op. They're not horrible to deal with, but co-ops, the reason why people don't like them is that you don't actually own the property. You own stock in a company which gives you a specific lease for your unit. So that means that the company, right, that the association, if they're mismanaged, you're gonna lose your entire property. And you are just one shareholder of many. So the rights you have over your unit are somewhat limited. So that's why they're not great. Lenders struggle with them too. So keep your eye out with co-ops. I never find them as a good investment. But for residential purposes, it's not a bad thing, but you just have to know your risk.
State of New Jersey court.
So these contracts are generated by the Realtor Board. Probably because you don't have the volume to make it worthwhile. That's all.
And there's one in Dover and there's one in Mendon Borough. Co-ops.
Co-ops, yeah. You eventually run across them.
I think so too. I
If
was looking for
you
Tabitha, I was looking for Tabitha because I know she just
Yeah.
did it and went through this whole thing with it.
keep something in mind, because it's sort of like a lease you have on your unit, the maintenance on co-ops are very big, but that's because it's accounting for property taxes.
Yes, everything's included in there.
Yeah, so like if your buyer sees it and like, I don't want it because of that maintenance, I would mention it includes property tax. It's all in. There you go. You have any
Heat,
questions?
water, everything,
Everything.
everything is included in there.
Yeah.
That was great, thank you.
All right, are you bored yet? No?
No,
Oh, man, I didn't do a good job. If you have questions, reach out to me. More than happy to give you further insight into it. But there you go. All right,
Did I miss it or did you did 42?
I did those first, 42 and
Oh,
43.
Okay.
I wonder, because those two are the most important. For tailoring anyway. There you go.
Thank you for lunch.
No, you got it. Yeah. I should run back and do some work now.
We all have to. Well,
Yeah.
other meeting.
Bored yet.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm never bored. I'm never bored.
Yeah.
But you.